Okay, we are about to start the next part of our mini conference. So our very first technical talk is presented by Roxana Pamfil, and we are super happy to have Roxana presenting here. She's a senior data scientist at QuantumBlack. Roxana is a senior data scientist in QuantumBlack based in London. She joined QuantumBlack in June 2019 and has worked with clients in the banking and insurance sector. And Roxana is a mathematician by training. You will hear more about that from her. She loves thinking about complex technical problems and has done research and development working on Bayesian networks that fed into the CausalNex library, which Anastasia in the previous talk mentioned briefly. In this talk, Roxana will present causal reasoning in machine learning with the help of CausalNex. A growing trend in data science and machine learning has been to move beyond correlations into the realm of causal relationship. In this talk, Roxana will present QuantumBlack's work on CausalNex, an open source library that leverages Bayesian networks to uncover structural relationships in data, learning conditional distributions, and observe the effect of potential interventions. She will also highlight some recent work that extends the methodology behind CausalNex for time series data. We are very happy to have you, Roxana. With that, I will give the stage to you.
Thank you very much, Sahar. And it's awesome to be here. Let me just share my screen and get things moving. I want to get my laser pointer. There we go. Right. So yes, with that intro, I can jump right in. I will tell you a little bit about how I became a data scientist, a bit more on how I got interested in causal inference, and then finally how we approach causal inference within QuantumBlack on our client work. And what I like about the role of a data scientist is that there are many possible paths that can lead to working in this type of role. But I think there is this magical trio of skills that are useful to develop. And they're basically knowledge of math, stats, and ability to read research papers because the field moves very quickly, coding, and then curiosity about various business areas or application areas. And, you know, since I was a university student, I basically developed my skills in all these three key areas. So I've always been interested in maths, and that's what I studied in university. And then I also pursued a PhD in applied maths. Then with coding, it was a gradual process. I didn't really code in Python until late during my PhD. But I think the stuff that came before was quite helpful as well. So in my hedge fund days, we were somehow using PHP for data analysis, which sounds crazy. But you know, it's still coding, it still helps. But I think the most exciting part is just, and one that sort of showed up within different times, you know, throughout my career, is an interest in other fields like computational biology and computer science, and also astrophysics. In the picture on the left, I'm looking at a galaxy that we were imaging in like a trip I had in university. And I really think this interest in other fields is key to being happy as a data scientist. And yeah, since I joined QuantumBlack just over 2 years ago, I'm obviously learning a lot about practical data science, and you know, expanding my coding skills and my knowledge of pipelining frameworks and MLOps processes. But I also got the opportunity to learn about causal inference. And that's what I'll focus on today. But first, I will just spend 1 minute trying to convince you that causal inference is important if you work in a data-driven field. And it's not always necessary. So for example, let's say you're trying to predict whether some piece of equipment in a factory might fail. And if you have a high-performing predictive model, then this can be enough, even if the model underneath the hood is based on learning correlations. However, if you're in one of the other two columns, where you want to explain why the equipment might fail, or even optimize the way the factory operates to reduce potential failures in the future, then conclusions will be wrong without the causal angle. And just to give a very silly example, let's focus on the graph on the right. We see that sales of ice cream are negatively correlated with the average weight of people in a population. But of course, it doesn't mean that encouraging people to eat as much ice cream as possible is a sensible public health intervention for reducing obesity. And this is obvious in this case, but with a lot of data sets, things can play out in a similar way, but more subtly. So the takeaway is that we really do need models to make causal sense before we implement any recommendations that come out of the analysis. So I wouldn't call myself an expert on causal inference, but it has been a journey, an ongoing journey to learn more about this field. And it started when I first joined QuantumBlack. And at the time, some colleagues had an idea for a little research project on Bayesian networks. And they saw that my PhD had network science in it. And they thought, surely that's related. It wasn't actually that related. But that's how with a colleague, I got pulled into this work. And it was a good way to learn about Bayesian networks, and which form the basis of some approaches for causal inference. And we actually published a paper. I'll come back to this briefly at the end. And you can also ask me about the acronym in the Q&A about where dinotears comes from. So now this is an academic paper. So it was focused on a fairly specific task. But at QB, we need to be practical and solve end-to-end business problems. Not just finding interesting structure in data, but actually using it to answer relevant business questions. And this is why some of my colleagues built CausalNex, which is open sourced, and gathers various pieces of academic work and other libraries into one easy-to-use interface. So after my work on the paper, I focused on this more practical side as a user of CausalNex. But even that, I felt like I had some gaps in understanding where some of these causal approaches were coming from. So on the side, I also tried to read more on various topics in the field. So papers, blog posts, and these two books here. These two books, which actually nicely summarize two schools of thought for causal inference. And the first one is called the Potential Outcomes Framework, and it's quite old. The basis of this comes from the 20s, from Neyman, and then Rubin in the 70s further expanded this type of work. The book that I referenced there is written by two researchers at the Harvard School of Public Health, and it's also freely available online. So it's a no regret move to check it out. And the idea of this framework is to try to answer a simple question, which is, if I have an individual and I observe a particular outcome for that individual, for example, that they recovered after receiving some medication. What is the difference between that outcome and the counterfactual outcome? Would they have recovered without receiving that drug? Now, of course, this is a lofty goal, but it has an obvious problem, namely that for a particular individual, we don't have access to the counterfactual outcomes. And the standard way to get around that is to run randomized experiments, so randomized control trials or A/B testing, which you might have heard of. And there, the idea is to randomly assign people to the treated and untreated groups, and then compare the average outcomes in those two groups to get a population level causal effects. But really the key focus of the theory of the potential outcomes framework is in cases where fully randomized experiments are either impractical, expensive, or unethical. And that's the hard part, really. On the other hand, we have the theory of structural causal models, which was championed by Judea Pearl, and he won a Turing Award for this work. And there are two key components of the structural causal modeling approach. One is relying on causal diagrams, so on the language of graphs, to capture assumptions explicitly, some of which can be tested with available data. And the second key contribution is to expand the normal language of probability theory with something called do calculus, which allows practitioners to move beyond asking correlation type questions to those that are related to interventions. So what would happen if a patient changes their diet, or with counterfactuals. So what if this patient who is a smoker had never smoked? So these theories are, compatible with each other, and often questions that can be answered with one can also be answered with the other one. But one takeaway that I want you to remember is that regardless of method, if we want to perform causal inference from observational data, we'll need to make some unverifiable assumptions. So we'll need to assume some things that no matter how much data we have, we won't be able to confirm or reject. So just keep in mind as I go through this. And for the rest of the talk, I'll explain how to leverage Bayesian networks for causal analysis. And just to give some context, a lot of the client work that we do starts from a pretty general point where basically clients come to us and they have a bunch of data and they ask us broad questions like, how can I increase my revenue, or how can we increase customer satisfaction? So we really need a way to sift through all that data to take those generic questions and turn them into specific recommendations. And with that in mind, the approach we take with CausalNex has 3 key steps. And step 1 relies on learning the structure of the data. So the idea is to take some tabular data and turn it into a graph that tells us how different variables depend on each other. And the output is a directed acyclic graph. And acyclic means that you don't go around in circles, because then you don't know what's a cause and what's an effect anymore. Once we have this graph in step 2, the idea is to overlay a probabilistic description of the data where we get a set of conditional distributions that specify how the value of each variable depends on all the upstream nodes, so everything that points to it. So in the example we have here, the income to the company could depend on whether there have been any new sales and what is the engagement of existing customers. And finally, we come to the third step, which is the most interesting one, and it's frankly why we've been doing all the work so far. And this is to conduct scenario analysis. So, for instance, what if the company made managers more specialized on specific products in the company's portfolio? Would that lead to additional sales? Would that lead to increased income? And that's where the magic of do calculus comes in. So now let me give a little bit more detail for each of these three steps. And we'll start from step one, where we learn the structure of the Bayesian network from our data. I'm using here an example data set that considers risk factors for heart attacks, which are also called myocardial infarction in the medical world. And when we build that graph, one option we have is to go to a cardiologist, to a medical specialist, and ask them to tell us about all the relationships they know about from the literature or from their work with patients. So for example, if there's a study that links smoking to hypertension, we would put an arrow on our graph there. One of the challenges of this is that it doesn't really scale very well. So here we have 25 variables, which means that there are roughly 25 squared potential relationships to review. And it's also possible that the literature hasn't studied every possible relationship. So if we just rely on previous evidence, we may miss some of these relationships. And that's where algorithms come in. And their purpose is not to replace experts, because they really have valuable expertise. But we can make their jobs easier by finding some of the structure automatically from data. And I'll explain a little bit later how that might work, what kind of algorithms there are for this. But as I said, one important thing to keep in mind here is that you can't just use the algorithm itself to give you an answer. There's nothing that will magically guarantee that, from observational data, you run an algorithm and you get a causal graph. So one way to involve subject matter experts in the process is to ask them to review the graphs that come out and also incorporate any knowledge they have into the algorithm. So before even running that algorithm, we could constrain certain edges from appearing in the graph, or require that other edges must be in the graph. So for our data set, perhaps one obvious restriction is that medical conditions shouldn't influence gender. So we would forbid those edges from appearing. But also if there is a particular link that has been very well established in the literature, we could enforce that it appears in the output of the algorithm. This is a very iterative process. So it is a matter of running the algorithm, reviewing the output, seeing what is not adequate, and then putting in more domain knowledge and running it again. And this may seem really strange compared to other ways of working that we have as data scientists, where we state our assumptions from the start, and then we let the computer do all the work. But it is really what allows us to interpret these edges as causal relationships, even though we don't have the kind of controlled setting we would get with fully with randomized experiments. Right, so at the end of the process, we would have this kind of graph that captures how variables depend on each other. And we can interpret these causally because we've reviewed everything with our subject matter expert. And just to give you an idea about how some of the algorithms work for finding the structure, there are others that work in completely different ways. But the idea would be to fit some sort of models to the data that is available. And in these models, each node is a function of all the variables that point to it. And in the simplest example, this function would just be a linear combination of the parent nodes. And one of these functions would exist at each of the variables in the graph. And by fitting these functions with the data we have, we can understand which edges should be there and which edges shouldn't be there. But I'll link some resources at the end for more details on how this works. So that's step one, and then we have step two, where we basically want to learn in a probabilistic way how each node in the graph depends on its parents. And at this point, we may have a combination of continuous data, categorical data, and binary data. In general, mixed data types can be quite tricky. So what we found is most flexible is to actually discretize the data or bin it. And once we do that, what we have at each node in our graph is a histogram. Though, of course, when we look at conditional probability distributions, we have to go beyond that and determine the probability, in this case, of somebody having a stent, given that they have age A and are from a particular region R. And we have to do this for all possible ages and regions. And then additionally, we would get two probabilities, one for having a stent and one for not having a stent. So in this toy example, we would get 2 times 2 times 2 probabilities. And the point here is that fitting these conditional probability distributions just becomes an enumeration problem of considering all possibilities. The tricky part is doing this in an efficient way. So that is step two. And now we get to the most interesting part, which is how do we leverage these Bayesian networks to answer interesting questions? And I'll consider this graph here. And I kind of put some interpretations for what A, B, C, and D could be, but an interesting exercise would be to come up with your own story about what these variables could represent, and then ask questions about that. So in scenario one, we observe D. So we observed that somebody was admitted to the hospital. And actually, this gives us information about other things that happened upstream in the graph. So if you observe that someone was given medical treatment, then we're actually learning something about how sick they are, or about their risk of having a stroke. So this updates the distributions of A, B, and C. But this is very different from intervening on node D, like in scenario 2. So if we just take a random person from the street and put them in the hospital, that won't change their probability of having heart disease, because if they were healthy, they will still stay healthy. So this is a really important point on the difference between observing or conditioning on a variable and intervening on one. But then what we might be interested in is perhaps intervene on node B. So we would do something to manage somebody's heart disease, perhaps prescribing aspirin or some other drug. And then we would see that that has an impact on their risk of stroke and their probability of being admitted to the hospital. And in CausalNex, it's possible to actually simultaneously intervene on some nodes and observe others, like in scenario 5. So for example, we could assess the impact of specific treatment on patients with high body mass indices. That's what conditioning on A would allow us to do. And this is a bit of a subjective view, but I really think that's where CausalNex becomes quite powerful, because you can design these very specific and targeted scenarios to understand the impact on what you're trying to optimize. And this is step 3 of our end-to-end causal analysis using Bayesian networks. I'll just make a quick note on how this works for time series data. This is actually the project that I started on when I first joined QuantumBlack. And this focuses on step 1 of our 3-step process. And all it does is that it looks at situations where variables don't just depend on each other in a simultaneous fashion, but we also have variables now influencing future values, like in the diagram on the slide. And I'll refer you to the Medium article for this. It's a 5-minute read if you want to understand more about it. I just want to say that the cool thing here is that once we do this structure learning step with time series data, the other 2 steps in CausalNex work in exactly the same way. Because ultimately, we're still working with a directed and acyclic graph. Okay, so that was my whirlwind tour of causal inference using Bayesian networks. I put some links to Medium articles that my colleagues have written. And you can also give CausalNex a try. It's easy to install and there's a nice tutorial. But even if you don't do any of this, I hope I still convinced you that causal inference is really important. If you're a data scientist or machine learning engineer, it's something to have in your toolkit. And yeah, go and explore it in your projects. And yeah, I'll be happy to take any questions at this point.
This is very cool. I think one cool thing might be, Roxana, if you have a moment later to paste some of the Medium links into the chat for people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it might make it a little bit easier. Let's see. So we don't really have any questions currently. So I would like to ask then myself, what would you say, if you can talk about it? Of course, I understand that in the consulting companies you work with customers, but of the things you can talk about, what was the most interesting project that you've done, you know, with this type of tools?
Yeah, so one of the co-authors on the paper I mentioned, actually she got to use it on a project quite early on, and it was around basically how a software engineering team works, like basically how they can work more efficiently. So I don't know a lot of details because I wasn't directly involved in that, but I thought that was an interesting area of application for sure. Also, this paper is about an application. They were basically looking at the expertise of medical scientists who were collaborating with a pharma company. So you can also read about a very specific use case there.
Okay, very cool. Yeah, I think we don't really have any questions, but one thing I can say is that this has been a really popular and really interesting topic in the last couple of years. And now we actually do have a questions, but in the chat. So somebody asks, do you feed the model on the entire network?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one situation in which you wouldn't is if you get a disconnected graph at the end. So maybe you have different components, and maybe the target variable, let's say, the thing you're interested in the most is in one particular component. You could just run your model on that and then kind of ignore the rest because it's not relevant. But yes, otherwise we wouldn't normally do any pruning because like you saw on an earlier slide, when you have these complicated scenarios, basically you would need to update the distributions of all sorts of nodes. So it's not always obvious how to prune the network.
So we are a little bit, now we're a little bit out of time, but we have a set of questions. Maybe Roxana could take a look at them while we move on to the next speaker.
Yeah, happy to.
So I really thank you very much for the talk, Roxana.